Welcome to AGAPE Social Justice, where we focus on love, truth, and justice. On today's episode, we're talking about trauma. You've heard a lot of people talking about mental health, mental illness, where this is in that vein. But today's episode is going to be very different than what you've been hearing in the past. Most people are not familiar with ACEs. I have an expert here who's going to talk about ACEs and talk about trauma in general, how that works, and the science behind it. So I'm looking forward to talking to you again today. We have Pastor Keon Payton with us today, and you're with you founded the Institute for Trauma and Economic Justice. I kept saying, let me make sure I get that straight. Institute for Trauma and Economic Justice.
Yes.
So talk to us a little bit about how you decided to get started with this. I know the last time you were with us on the show, you shared your personal story.
Sure.
In terms of how trauma impacted your life, how trauma impacted your family, and then how that trauma plays out in the church. And now fast forward to today, now you're an expert in this area. You've created an institute and you're trying to help other people in the community. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into that.
Sure. First, let me say thank you for inviting me and welcoming here again to this space. It's always a pleasure and joy to converse with you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for your advocacy and your support for expressing the need for more love in our society and more social justice. Let me address Pastor Payton, because oftentimes a lot of people say, well, how can a pastor be an expert in something that is relative to science? So first I want to, full disclosure, I'm not trained in science. I'm a master trainer of trainers in ACEs, Average Childhood Experiences. The expert is the founder of the ACE study, Dr. Robert Anda, who is a partner in our organization. And so we host events where we create greater ACE awareness, and I do personal and corporate training on average childhood experiences. And so I'll tell you how a pastor got involved with this. So, of course, the last time we were here, I think I shared with you some of my trauma. This is 30 years for ministry for me. June will be 30 years in ministry. And just being a pastor and being in ministry, particularly in an urban, economically disadvantaged community, trauma is something that is not new to pastors. Pastors and ministry leaders grapple with the effects of untreated trauma in our pews and in our congregations on a daily basis, on a regular basis, with people who in our communities experience a number of types of traumas and don't know the healthy outlets for being able to address the traumas that they've sustained. And so my journey actually started in ACEs in 2019. I was led to do a sermon series in my church entitled What's Going On? And it was based on the life and story of Marvin Gaye. It was meant to be a little bit disruptive. And so for a very conservative, traditional Baptist church like mine, when I played What's Going on Sunday morning.
Oh, wow.
It didn't bode too well with some of the members. And in fact, some left after that. They said, why are we playing secular music in the Lord's house? But for me, it wasn't that I was trying to be disruptive for the sake of being disruptive. I think that sometimes stirring up good trouble is a good thing, if I can use the late John Lewis's analogy there. Sometimes good trouble helps to jolt our consciousness to the issues that are important in society. And so I did that sermon series, and the first sermon was the song. And I talked about the video of what's going on. I don't know if you saw the video, but if you watch the video, what you'll see is Marvin is illustrating all of the devastation and destruction that was going on in Harlem, particularly as it relates to the rise of crack and cocaine in our communities that has caused so much trauma in many of our families when crack was infiltrated into many of our communities. And subsequently, he shows this devastation, but what I saw in the video amid the devastation was that on every street corner there was a church. And while that was Harlem, I pastor in Pontiac, where in a small, relatively small community as Pontiac, we have a significant number of churches in a very, very short mile radius. And similarly, I began to really look at myself as a pastor and began to ask the question, why is it that we have all of this devastation happening in our communities and we have the churches? Because the scripture says that God gives the church the keys to the kingdom, and the gates of hell should not prevail against the church. So why are all of these hellacious things happening in our communities when there's so many pastors and churches and church members and leaders in our respective communities? And so that sermon series was really to raise the consciousness of my own members and to begin to take us down a road of critical thinking and analysis as to what can we be doing better to address the needs that's happening in our community. It was around that same time that I entered into a doctoral program at Garrett Evangelical Seminary at Northwestern University to do a doctorate in strategic leadership for Black congregations with a focus on treating and preventing childhood adversity, or ACEs. For those who don't know, ACEs, it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And so it really was that course study that set me on the trajectory to better understand ACEs, to better understand how adversity impacts our lives from a standpoint emotionally, but also how it impacts our brains neurologically. So I now, since I've become a master trainer of trainers in ACEs by Dr. Andrew, the founder of the ACE study, I have come to learn that when a person sustains trauma over an extended period of time, that toxic stress that the brain experiences releases toxic chemicals in the body that not only alter our cognitive behavior, but it also alters our DNA. So our bodies are actually changed as a result of the traumas that we sustain in our lives. And so oftentimes what people say is bad behavior is really not bad behavior. But according to science, it is normative behavior that is based upon a series of maltreatment that causes maladaptive behavior as a consequence. So our brains are literally impacted by trauma, which causes our cognitive ability to be impaired as a result. And so the work that we do with ITEJ is to create greater awareness on how each of us, regardless of if you grew up in a white family or a Black family, wealthy or not wealthy, everybody has been impacted by trauma. But the difference is that when you're in economically disadvantaged communities, you often don't have the positive experiences or the financial resources to get redress for the traumas that you've sustained. And so our organization is dedicated to that mission.
Yes, that was a lot that you just said. And I think one of the things that sticks out in my mind that I had never heard anyone say before is that trauma becomes a part of our DNA. That's a bitter pill to swallow.
Absolutely.
I mean, so does this mean that now we're passing this on to the next generation?
Absolutely. Intergenerational trauma.
I remember when I was pregnant and people would say, you know, the older women, right, in the church, you would hear them say, baby, don't get upset, don't frown, because the baby's experiencing that, or they're going to come out that way, or they'll be this when they grow up. And we ignore those things.
Sure.
You know, because no one teaches you this when you're in school. When I never had a science class that talked about trauma or talked about, when we talked about DNA, if you did, this never came up.
Absolutely.
So I feel like that's probably the most shocking aspect of the science behind trauma.
Absolutely.
How do people normally respond to you when you say that?
Well, initially it's fascinating. And then after the fascination, people begin to reflect on their own personal traumatic experiences, particularly women. If you look at our logo, you know, our website is itej.org. It represents the acronyms for Institute of Trauma and Economic Justice. But on our site and on our logo, you can see a mother who is holding a child, and above her head there is a halo. And we're really just talking about the sacredness of the female body and how while we're not called to worship one another, we should certainly do all that we can to ensure that our women, our pregnant women in particular, have healthy, positive experiences, particularly while they're pregnant. Because imagine, if the brain, after sustaining chronic stress for a certain period of time, if you're a pregnant woman, those toxic chemicals are not only impacting your body, but they're also impacting that fetus that's in the womb. So literally, the more trauma, the more toxic stress that you are experiencing in your life, that is being passed through your DNA to your child, who is also now being formed in the womb with those toxic chemicals, which can impact them cognitively, behaviorally, and have all number of challenges that science has now confirmed with evidence that adversity early in childhood, and particularly in the womb, can cause later in life consequences and health consequences.
So talk to us a little bit about, will we refer to this as symptoms or the effects of trauma? How does that unfold? What will we see in a young child, in an older child, and an adult? What does that look like?
So we're seeing ADHD, ADD, some of the things that we are medicating our children on because prior to catching up with the science. So first of all, the ACE study was conducted in the 1990s by Dr. Rob Andin and Dr. Vincent Felitti. And at the time that they conducted the study, it was being commissioned by the Center for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente. And when they first disclosed this study showing this evidence, people laughed at them and said, no way this could be possible. But now, all these many years later, with the evolution of science, and particularly in neuroscience and epigenetics, we now know that it is biologically confirmed that lives can be impacted by trauma. And so the goal then is to ensure that early childhood development, we are creating the types of structures around not only the mothers or the caregivers of children, but also those children to ensure that their brains are not being impacted by adversity.
Right. I can't believe that this evidence has been here for this long and we just completely ignored it as a society. That seems to be a running theme, I feel like, in America, that the information that we need is there, but we don't want to embrace it because it sounds like our brains can't comprehend that.
Absolutely.
So now that we have these studies, now that we have more people talking about how trauma unfolds, schools are even now providing trauma-informed training to their staff. So when you get this training, what are they telling us to look for? Like, how can I spot trauma in my child? If I'm an educator, how would I spot trauma in a student? So ADHD is one thing that you mentioned. What else is that?
Well, really, any cognitive behavior that we deem to be abnormal could potentially be a normative response to maladaptation, to maltreatment in a child. And so once our brains are impacted in that way, it causes brain damage that causes us to act in ways that sometimes we're even not conscious that we're acting in those ways. But it doesn't mean that that child or that person is a lost cause. The brain can heal. And the brain heals from positive experiences and by love, by feeling that you're safe, by feeling that you're cared for, by feeling that you belong. All these types of positive experiences actually can reverse the damage that's been caused by that maladaptation. But in order, obviously, to get to a point where we can begin to turn a person's life around or to redeem a negative outcome or consequence in that way, people have to first be aware.
Right.
If not for themselves, parents need to be aware. You mentioned schools. Schools need to be aware. So for example, if a child is acting up in class, right? You know, when I was coming up, I was kicked out of 3 different private schools, right? Because people said I was a bad kid. And it wasn't necessarily because I was bad. I had a lot of trauma going on that I was processing on my own and didn't have an outlet to be able to discuss it.
Right.
So being able to provide assessments where persons can feel safe enough to acknowledge where they have perhaps experienced traumas in their lives, and then be able to get them the right support services. In addition to positive experiences, we need to go to therapy. And not just do children need to go to therapy, but adults need to go to therapy as well. You have teachers that are living unconsciously with untreated childhood trauma. That when they see another child acting up, their traumas may be triggered, which may cause a trauma response in them that could produce a negative outcome for the child that they're trying to teach in the classroom.
Wow.
So I think the more we begin to create greater awareness around this, the more we begin to train not only educators, but pastors and church leaders, because the church can often cause issues where instead of us providing healing, we too can cause trauma. You know, early in my ministry, I will acknowledge, and God knows, if I've traumatized anybody, church hurt is real. And I've been a pastor at New Bethel for 16 years. And so I'm sure that my own ignorance of not knowing this information in science perhaps caused harm or injury to others. And so certainly if that has happened to anyone that I've been in contact with, I acknowledge and apologize for that. But I think that in my acknowledging it, it is also an opportunity for all of us to acknowledge in every sector of industry. If someone's not showing up to work on time on a regular basis, instead of thinking that they're lazy or they don't want to work, maybe they're experiencing paralyzing ambivalence, where they're going through so much trauma that it has impacted their brain in such a way where they freeze and they don't know what to do. So think about it, right? The brain has what's called a fight or hide response, right? It's really three different ways it goes: fight, flight, or freeze.
Right.
So when a person goes through something, if their brain is impacted by a lot of trauma and they have a lot of stress in their bodies, which can be measured through measuring cortisol. If a person has a lot of toxic stress in their bodies, it impacts their cognitive ability, right? So if I'm in a situation where I have to make a quick split-second decision, if I have a lot of toxic stress, I'm probably not going to make the best right decision. Right? And so to the extent that we began to do more training, more awareness around this, I'm very excited and happy. That's actually how I stumbled across most of this work, is because of states that were becoming trauma-informed and resources that are being provided for trauma, being more trauma-informed. And unfortunately, it is my personal view that because of the opioid crisis and because of the gun violence that we have been seeing being perpetuated by non-minorities, where so many lives are being taken in public schools that impact the majority, right? People are asking the question, what's wrong with our kids? And now all of these sciences are beginning to cooperate to give us better clarity and understanding about what's going on. But what you and I know, Stephanie, as African Americans, is that oftentimes we are the last to get the information. Resources will be made available, right? When the crack crisis was going on and so many of our families were impacted by trauma, historical trauma plays a significant role in the adversity that could impact how we live our lives. So have we dealt with post-traumatic slave syndrome?
No.
There are so many issues that impair our families from being healthy because of the intergenerational transmission of trauma that's related to our historical root trauma of not only slavery, but Jim Crow. So, all those other issues with segregation. When you think about Black Lives Matter movement, even recently, and people say, well, why are you always talking about white on black? It's not necessarily white on black. We just saw in Memphis where police officers, black police officers, killed an innocent unarmed man, beat him to death, right? Well, oftentimes those types of behaviors can, not always, but can be sometimes explained through persons not being able to be aware of how trauma has impacted their own lives and subsequently hurt people.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point with this. And as you were talking about how the trauma can sometimes be triggering for people, I have thought about that as I think about the Tyree Nichols case, because you look at how the officers responded and it's almost like something, like a switch was flipped. It seemed like they became different people, and you're like, my goodness, how can you become so inhumane? They probably will watch it back and think about their behavior, because now it's come out that they have inflicted this trauma on other people. Some of them
Sure.
have. And so they'll probably sit back, and at some point, my hope is that they'll reflect on what happened to them that caused them to be triggered, what happened to them in their lives to cause them to be that way. And the other thing I thought about is an administrator who I've had some struggles with. And I look at how this administrator interacts with students, and it's hard to tell sometimes who's the adult.
Mm.
And in my mind, I'm like, this is so easy.
Sure.
This is so simple. Don't you see? Like,
Sure.
you don't, that's not the way you should respond. But now I'm wondering, is there some aspect of some trauma or something that's there that triggers this response, that then I see this childlike behavior that then gets exhibited, and that's why we can never break that conflict that exists?
Well, there's so many complexities to this. It is definitely tied to historical traumas and how the black body has been stigmatized, where persons feel that black bodies need to be controlled. There is an excellent book that I'm reading right now as part of my doctoral work called My Grandmother's Hands. I don't know how to pronounce the gentleman's first name, but Mensa, I believe, is the last name. But it's an excellent book that kind of demonstrates the reality of how historical trauma and the perception of people become a bias that plays into our cognitive response on how we treat those people based upon our perceptions. And black people can treat black people like that because it has been, we also can believe the lie, right? About the pervasive, you think about the perception of black men being the angry black man, right? And those types of things. And so those types of stigmas, I think, are going to have to be addressed, where we can look at our own implicit biases to see how we may be using those biases in ways that are not productive. The other thing I'll say about that is, unfortunately, because of so much going on in our world, we do need police officers. We need to keep our streets safe. But unfortunately, in this climate that we have, there are so many who don't want to be police officers. And so what that does is that leaves our communities in places where we don't have enough police officers on the street. And a lot of these police officers are working overtime, right? They're working 16 hours, maybe more a day. So if I'm working all of those hours in a high-stress position, how much is that impacting me? Because I'm not a robot, right? I'm a human being. So if I'm working these overtime hours, and I may have a terrible marriage at home, my financial situation may not be where it needs to be, I may have issues with my kids, who knows what human beings may be going on and dealing with at home. But when they come, they're putting on a smile that's masking all of the traumas that their bodies are processing. So that when their cortisol levels are very high and they're in high stress situations and have to make split-second decisions, oftentimes they too can make the decisions that are not in the best interest of themselves or, God forbid, even the public, when they've been called to protect and preserve the safety of the public. So these are the types of conversations that, with experts who are more learned and more informed, particularly about allostatic load, where you can measure a person's stress. I believe that those types of persons need to be in the room with us as we are engaging the conversation with law enforcement to say, what can we do to provide more assessments? How can we assess the traumas of our police officers, et cetera, to ensure that they're not having a traumatic response as a result of the traumas that's just in their bodies and causing maladaptive behavior.
And I would add to that, expand it to first responders in general, because now what we're starting to see is not even just the officers who are on the scene and aren't responding appropriately, and expand it to our schools and to, quite frankly, anybody, because in the workforce, there is not a lot of empathy for people in terms of what they go through in their daily lives. We're expected to almost be like robots to show up and somehow just magically remove that trauma. And life just doesn't work that way. One of the things that really gives me hope about the work that you do is not just the awareness piece, it's not just the education, but in the couple minutes that we have left, talk about how there's actually something positive that we can do about this. I mean, there is something tangible that we can do to help people who have experienced trauma.
Well, you just used the word empathy, right? I think it starts there. I think with acknowledging that each of us are human and we are all susceptible to making decisions that may not necessarily be the right decisions, that we have to give more space for grace. That when people don't make the right decisions, let's not give people throw the book at them and throw them away. We live, unfortunately, in a cancel culture where you can live your entire life making all the right decisions, Will Smith, and in a moment where you might have been triggered, you just wrote a book about your trauma, and you're on live stage in the best moment of your life, and here you have a response that you've now been, and not to justify actions, right? It's to better understand actions. And so I think that's the first step that we can do. But then also what we can do is we can begin to try to provide access to more positive experiences. Let's not work people to death. Let's think about ways that we can ensure that people are having family time that they need and having the right types of vacation time and making certain that when they have vacation time, they can actually have vacation. Because sometimes vacation for people is going home and doing more work. So those, we laugh, but those are very serious methods and strategies that I think we have to, as a society, look at. The last thing I'll say is that, particularly in our criminal justice reform system, we don't provide the proper rehabilitation to our inmates, and let me not choose that word, to our incarcerated citizens, because they are people too. And even though they're there, they're paying their debt to society. So let's make certain we give them the right tools, the right resources. Let's give them the behavioral health support services that they need. Let's give them the right tools to equip them that once they get out, we can reduce the rate of retention so that they can become gainfully employed when they get out. So those are strategies I think that we need to discuss further in our communities.
Absolutely. I'm in agree with you 1,000%. For those who want to learn more about this, where can they find you online to get more information?
Absolutely. So if you'd like to learn more about the Institute of Trauma and Economic Justice, please visit our website at itej.org. Again, the Institute of Trauma and Economic Justice, and the acronym itej.org.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming and kind of breaking down the science behind this, because the more we get the word out, the more we can begin to be proactive and not just reactive for future generations.
Absolutely.
We actually have control over this time.
Absolutely.
Right? And that
we
really
have the
excites
choice.
me. Thank you so much for coming. To our listening audience, today is something that I know you'll probably need to play again. You'll probably need to listen to this again so you can actually digest all of the information that you heard. But when you do so, I want you to take the time to reflect upon it. Think about trauma that may have impacted you in your life and how that might play out in your parenting, how that plays out in your marriage, how that plays out in the workplace, in your congregation, with your neighbors. There's just so many things that have shaped us, and we've not even been conscious of it. So one of the things I will ask you to do is please commit to doing that. Talk to your children, talk to your relatives, go to your school and ask, do you offer trauma-informed training to your educators? And make sure that we're creating a society where we can all have empathy and we can all love each other in the way that we should. This isn't the first time that you'll hear about it. We'll bring more information to you. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.